Some pawn structures can be your best friend or your worst nightmare. Two of the most typical pawn structures you should learn how to both play with and against are isolated and hanging pawn structures. In this endgame, white has an isolated pawn on d4. An isolated pawn is a pawn that is disconnected from the rest of the pawn structure and cannot be protected by another pawn. Isolated pawns can only be protected by pieces, so this makes it a serious weakness in the endgame. Notice that all of white's major pieces are passively defending the isolated pawn, while black's major pieces enjoy more space and put serious pressure on white's d4 pawn. Black is already threatening e5, not a position white wants to defend. Let's take a look at an isolated pawn position in the middle game. White has an isolated pawn on d4. When you have an isolated queen pawn, you should generally keep as many pieces on the board as possible and try to use these pieces to set up an attack, often on the king side. A positive of the isolated pawn is that since there are not any pawns on the files next to it, in this case the c and the e files, this means white can often use these files for attack. Rooks are especially useful on these files. When you are defending against an isolated pawn, you do not want to allow it to advance, which opens up more lines for attack and often eliminates the long-term weakness of the isolated pawn. The best way to do this is by blocking the square directly in front of the pawn, in this case, the d5 square. Black is threatening knight b4 to d5 when black blockades white's isolated pawn. The defender will look to trade pieces and work toward an endgame like the one we looked at a moment ago. With white to play, white plays the important a3, preventing black from playing knight b4. If black still tries to block the isolated pawn with knight d5, notice black's knight is no longer protecting h7, so white can continue to develop and create kingside threats with queen d3. Black either has to waste time retreating the knight back to f6 or create long-term weaknesses on the kingside with a move like g6. After a3, a more common idea for black is to play b6, preparing to place the bishop on the long diagonal and help control the square in front of the isolated pawn, the d5 square. After queen d3, placing pressure on black's kingside, in bishop b7, white eliminates the isolated queen pawn and opens up the position with d5. It looks like white is simply losing a pawn after e takes d5, but this opens up the e-file for white's rook, placing pressure on black's bishop on e7. After bishop g5, white is threatening bishop takes f6 and checkmate on h7, so black is forced to make the weakening move g6. Now that the knight is only protected by the bishop, white takes advantage of the weak dark squares with rook takes e7. The only way to protect the f6 knight is to play queen takes e7. And now white has the crushing knight takes d5, attacking the queen and pin knight on f6. White will play knight takes f6 check on the next turn with a crushing attack. The next structure we'll look at is hanging pawns. Hanging pawns are two pawns on connecting files that are isolated from all other pawns. Hanging pawns are similar to isolated pawns. They can often be targets of attack, especially in endgames, but they also can be powerful pawns that can advance, sometimes creating a powerful pass pawn or helping create attacking chances. In this position, white has hanging pawns on c4 and d4. White uses the hanging pawns to create a powerful attack, starting with d5. The d5 pawn attacks the knight on c6 and the pawn on e6. This move also opens up the dark squared bishop on the long diagonal, pointing directly at black's king. If black captures the d5 pawn with e takes d5, the e-file has been opened and black is in serious trouble when white's other hanging pawn, now an isolated pawn, recaptures with c takes d5. If black moves the knight on c6, white wins a piece with queen takes e7. Black cannot capture the d5 pawn because after queen takes d5, white wins the queen with bishop takes h7 check. Since the pawn cannot be captured, black may try the aggressive-looking knight b4. But white can simply play bishop b1. White is threatening to trap black's knight after a3, and white is also prepared to play d takes e6, discovering an attack on black's queen. Black's position is going to collapse. This leaves us with the knight retreat, knight b8. Black's defenses are overwhelmed after queen e4, threatening checkmate, and after g6, white's queen swings over to the dark squares with queen d4, once again threatening checkmate. After f6, white crashes through with rook takes e6. As you can see, a well-developed army can be a very dangerous force with hanging pawns leading the charge. Hanging pawns can also be a weakness, especially since hanging pawns require pieces to protect them. In this position, white's hanging pawns are under pressure. Black is threatening to win a pawn with knight takes d4. After bishop e3, white adds more protection to one of the hanging pawns, d4. Now black is able to put pressure on the other hanging pawn with knight a5. Black's knight attacks white's queen, and with the rook on c8, the c4 pawn is under serious pressure. Black's light-squared bishop is now attacking a key defender of the d4 pawn, the knight on f3. Capturing that knight would also ruin white's structure on the king side. White has too many weaknesses to try and protect and has a bad position. After exploring how to play with and against isolated and hanging pawns, now it's time to put your skills to the test.